Hey, hello, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of getting students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. And today we have Michael Sutton. Michael, are you prepared to engage?
I'm definitely engaged. I'm committed, and I'm part of what we want to create as an endeavor here. Let's have some fun.
Let's do this, Michael. And to give you a brief intro into who Michael is, he has built his reputation as a game-based learning innovator, architect, and edupreneur. His current applied research and consulting focuses on architecting and delivering immersive environments using serious games, workshops, and simulations. The initiatives leverage earning experiences by transforming key performance and quality indicators into increased learner satisfaction and institutional effectiveness. He has also established an exceptional record of success in educational program delivery, learning communities development, competency-based assessment, and problem-based educational program management through innovative adult educational and online programs. Is there anything I'm missing from that, or anything else personal you would like to talk to us about, Michael?
Well, I must say, when you frame it like you did, I didn't realize I'd done all those things. Thank you. That's a great introduction.
That's fantastic, Michael. And we were talking in the pre-interview chat that you have an interesting story, and I have this cliffhanger for myself about how you got into gaming and to the game industry or these engagement relationships. So I would like to know what that story is so that we can kick off with something interesting.
Well, thanks very much, Roberto. It's very important for especially new people getting into this area to understand the history of some of the folks that are involved. And I kind of consider myself an old fart in this area, but not an expert, and definitely not a guru, because I'm learning to play every day and learning more about how we engage fun and play for learning. One of the elements of my early days was I was in school what we now call geeks or nerds. Back then, that was in the 50s and 60s, we were called eggheads. So, and that was just because, you were a brainy little kid kind of thing. And the first thing I asked my father for at 12 years old was a slide rule along with a log table. Now, in school, those of us who were eggheads, we used slide rules to solve all kinds of nice, interesting mathematical problems. And it used to come in a holster. So for those 3 or 4 nerds or geeks in the classroom with you, the cool thing was someone would present a problem and then everyone would draw their slide rule just like you would a gun in an old Western out of your holster and start on the problem. And because I did that a lot, I played chess a great deal. And a much older mentor of mine taught me a game called Go, which is a Japanese game normally played by Shinto monks as a form of meditation and strategy development. And so I became very good at Go. I loved Go. And I even found it superior to chess. And I was one of the first kids in our high school to buy one of those supposed expert system artificial intelligence boxes that you could play chess against. And I found half of the time I won, half of the time I didn't. So I was at least challenged by the machine. And from that, started to play games like Risk, Diplomacy, Stratego, a lot of the early classical strategy games associated with having board games. And as I went from high school into my first jobs in computer programming, I found all kinds of games. Now, when I say computer programming, I mean 1970s computer programming, not the coding that's done today. And from then on in, I learned to play games against machines. I eventually in my career was involved a great deal in learning, training, and development in corporate environments. And I would always gamify the environment. Now, we didn't call it that back then in the 80s and late 70s. We would have called it probably skills-based. It would currently be called experiential or project-based. And I always facilitated my courses for participants from the perspective that they had to have fun and not be bored in order to be able to learn. So from there, just expanded my work. When I was in my, I think I turned 50 years old, I got invited by McGill University in Montreal, Canada, to go back and do my doctorate in knowledge management. I was a corporate executive at that stage. And when I did that, I took on a dissertation on how knowledge management was taught at universities at that time. It was a new and emerging field. And when I got to university to start teaching as a professor, all of my courses were project-based, competency-based, skills-based, project-based, very experiential. I hardly ever gave a lecture. In fact, the learners in my courses, Masters of Science courses, MBA courses, undergrad business courses, doctoral courses, they were the ones that had to invent games to demonstrate what they were learning in the class. So that kind of wraps up how I got to where I'm at now.
Wow, that sounds fantastic, Michael. I didn't feel like interrupting you at any point because I was so interested. I think seeing how things have come for you is in a way looking at a bit of the history of how many of these things have come into being. Of course, I'm sure there's people with other experiences as well, but it's really interesting and getting to know how you got there.
Thank you. It's been a fun experience, and even though I'm kind of semi-retired right now, my wife says she doesn't know which half of me is retired. I'm at the stage where I want to contribute significantly more toward higher education, toward corporate learning and development by helping to transform these very staid, boring courses into something that learners will want to embrace, engage in, commit to, and walk away with sticky knowledge.
That's true. So now, Michael, I would like to precisely take all of your experience and all this baggage that you might have from all these things that you've done and ask you for a story. And this is the kind of story that I like to call the story of maybe your favorite failure when using these strategies that now are called gamification or maybe creating games. Especially, it would be ideal if it's in the training or learning or educational arena. And of course, I always like to frame it, if you will, into something that probably took you into a place of learning a lot from such an experience, because failure is always accompanied as well from a lot of learning or perhaps even by future success. So tell us that story, Michael. What does it look like?
Well, I'm glad you bring this up because even in knowledge management, lessons learned, after action reviews, etc., are incredibly useful foundations for knowledge acquisition and knowledge sharing. So within the gamified environments, one of the problems, I've got kind of two mini stories. One of the problems I ran into when I was using game-based learning in a business school was that the faculty would come by my office on occasion. I was kind of in a central area, so they would have to pass by. And these are faculty who, I was a recently minted PhD at that time, even though I was 57. These were faculty who had been teaching for 30 years, and their noses were up in the air. And they would see all these boxes of games, Legos, all of these things on the wall that would be board games that the learners had created. And they would put their nose in the air and they would say, "How is it that your students can learn by having fun?" And my response was, well, I think you probably started in a sandbox somewhere. That would have been your first learning experiences. And guess what? You forgot to have fun. I said, how are those learners handling all those boring 3-hour lectures? And the response from a couple of the professors were, well, if they do not hear my golden words, there is no way they can learn. So that was one of my significant failures, was I could not get the staid traditional university professors to see a value proposition in a business school for something like game-based learning. The second area I ran into was one class, a course I gave. At the end of the first class of that course, I asked, as we're embarking upon the next 8 weeks, any issues, concerns that you'd like to talk about right now. And at least a third of the class raised their hand, and we had a discussion, and basically the biggest problem they had was that this game thing and creating a game to demonstrate their learning, why couldn't I just lecture at them for 3 hours, take tests, and give them a mark? So that class, because that a third of the class participants went to the dean and complained that they wanted someone much more conventional, and these were millennials, Gen X, and Gen Y. So I failed miserably in that course.
Wow. And from the two experiences, Michael, what would you say is your key takeaway? Like you were mentioning before, and when building knowledge, what would you say? Hindsight is always 20/20. What do you think would be something that we could learn from and say, well, in the future, if I encounter a situation like this one, maybe I could run in this direction?
Well, you might want to run totally into the woods screaming and kicking. I mean, one of the things that I forgot to do was to market and advertise. I mean, it's a business school. I should have known better. I should have realized.
If you're going to create a game, you better advertise it, because if nobody buys it, it's almost as though you didn't create it, right?
That is correct. So if the learners hadn't realized that in coming into my course they were going to be playing games, then it must have come as quite a shock to them. So finding incremental ways to make the learners more aware of how games play a critical role in learning, instead of assuming they would want to play games, would be my takeaway from the learner side. From the professor side, I'm sorry, but most of our universities are so caught up as bureaucracies that they've forgotten that they're there for the learning. And what these professors demonstrated were that the university was there for them, for their comfort. And there would be nothing I could do to change that. I tried for 9 years at the university I was at. It did not work.
That's too bad. But I didn't want to jump into that before you mentioned it. But I would say that if somebody responds that way, I mean, they might even be very accomplished and successful professors. I'm not saying that everybody has to use this approach, and otherwise they're a failure. But right. Having said that, there might be others who would greatly benefit from that, because their classes are mediocre at best. But there's nothing you can do about getting them into doing something new if they're very comfortable where they are, and they don't really care about changing, and they don't really care about getting better and learning by themselves as well. Then I mean, it's not on you. They're not the objects of your learning. So probably what I would say is, of course, you can always have those interactions and try to convince them, but the main thing is that you do your thing and you do it great.
Well, that was the mission I took on. And regretfully, though, normally we got at that university a sabbatical in our 8th year to go off and do research. So I submitted my proposal. It was a peer-reviewed proposal, so my faculty had to approve it. And it was not approved.
Hmm.
So I decided to resign and find other avenues I could work in where people could appreciate better what I could contribute.
But that's I'm sure that after that you also had. I mean, you're here now today. We're talking today in this podcast. You're as we mentioned in the introduction, you're very accomplished in what you do. So I'm sure that that was just maybe a bump in the road, and you got many other interesting things going on right after that.
Oh yes, very much so.
So that was actually a good thing to happen.
Thanks
almost.
for bringing us back to the positive side.
No, I'm sure, and as usual, I don't think that failure is final or fatal in any way. I mean, of course, unless it brings fatality in itself. But even then, there's things that you can learn, and there's always a bright side on the other end, and there's many things that we can learn and that can help us improve ourselves.
Well,
after the experience,
it provided me the opportunity to become a bit more. I hesitate to use evangelical about this field, and because of it, other opportunities have been drawn to me.
That's it. And Michael, I would like to now make a quick shift into actually going on to a more, as you say, positive side, and for you to tell us about perhaps some interesting challenge or something that you faced, maybe in your classes, maybe in your designs, maybe in your consultations, that you said, well, this is a very interesting and big challenge that you faced, and say, well, and let us know what that challenge was and how did you solve it using these game approaches that you've been using.
Well, the biggest challenge I have encountered in teaching leadership and teamship is that there is so much good academic foundational material in this area now, and yet much of it is just that, academic and not pragmatic. So when I delivered an MBA leadership course, one of the first things I said to the learners in the class was, will you be comfortable going outside of the classroom? And the majority response was yes. So I would take them into the hallways. We'd set up games in the hallways and in the atrium where they would learn skills associated with leadership and competencies. And I evaluated and assessed those using a rubric as a way of demonstrating to them that to learn, you have to do it. You cannot just read about it. And in fact, one of the interesting exercises I had for them was when we hit a module on the entrepreneurial mindset, I said, okay, here's $10 for each of you. So out of my pocket, I gave each of them $10. And there's 21 people in the classroom. And I said, now you got to work in groups of threes. You go downtown, and you've got to break the 10 into ones, and you have to give away $1 bills one at a time to strangers, and your other two team members need to be observing you and filming you. That was the most revolutionary thing any of them had ever done. First off, if you've ever been in a situation where someone comes up to you in the street and wants to give you money, you know that that's not an easy situation as one would expect. And of course, I ruled out street people, etc., that they could give the money away to. You had to get regular people on the street. At the end of that game, they came back. Most of them had about $8 left. They gave it back to me. And then we played a number of the videos of them trying to give away their money. I said, so what have we learned about marketing? What have we learned about communication? What have we learned about emotional intelligence? And we spent the next 2 classes debriefing on that singular experience.
Wow, that sounds like a very, very interesting experience. And before you were mentioning as well that if you want to learn something, you have to do it. And I've heard a number of times recently, if you want to be, do. And it was especially a guy who He's one of my inspirations for creating a podcast. And he said, if you want to be a podcaster, then you have to do podcast. I mean, if this is what you want to be, then do it, and you'll get better. I mean, I'm sure there's many things I can learn, and that's another reason for me to be here, and that's another reason for me to learn along the way with the engagers who are interested in the topics that we're talking about and learning alongside me and the guests. So that's absolutely aligned with what we enjoy and what we like to do over here. So thank you for that. A very, very nice example, very neat example. And one thing that I highlight with these kinds of examples is if you take a look at Michael literally spent if it was $2 in average per student, probably that was $40. So you don't need a multi-billion-dollar budget to create an app for mobiles, to create a game, to do these strategies and of a simulation, of a game, of gamification in your class. So always remember that doing these strategies and these things, if you want, it can involve a digital and complex solution, but it can be very simple and very powerful as well.
Very much so. In fact, just along those lines, most of the professors who found out that I did this said, how could you risk losing so much money? And I said, first off, most of it came back. And second off, I risked nothing. The learners risked everything.
Absolutely. And Michael, when you're creating your experiences inspired by games or even games and simulations, is there any process that you follow to create your designs? And if so, can you run us quickly through that process?
Well, I follow very much Carl Kapp's game design method, and I'm trying to think of the young lady that he's worked with recently and authored a book on workshop design for games. I follow very much their method. There's no reason to create a new one, and much of their method is very parallel to the agile approach and design thinking approach to building new things. So integrating design thinking, indicating Carl Kapp's approach, gives people a very good foundation to prototype their new game, serious game.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, Carl is a past guest from this show, and he was mentioning the book. I'm trying to remember the name of his co-author, and I'm actually in his webpage right now. I'm trying to find it, but I can't see the name of the. Maybe it's one of the newest books as well. Anyways, that's fantastic. So if you want to know what Michael does, you can just follow Carl and take a look at his process and follow it as well. And I think it's a very valid and useful strategy. I don't have like my own registered, very differentiated process from everybody else. What I do is take bits and pieces from processes that other people use, and sometimes use one, sometimes use another one, and take the best out of it depending on the situation. So that's very valid and very useful as well, Michael. And thanks for that validation, so to speak.
Well, one of the things that we're always presented with, there must be I've counted 22 different methodologies for game design and game mechanics. And just picking one and getting in-depth experience with it gives a new game designer significant experience, and then test out some others. To me, Carl is probably one of the critical thought leaders in our industry or in our profession, and following people like that is easy to then learn and to learn with them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So now, Michael, we're going to move into the second part of the interview, where rather than stories and maybe longer winded answers, we're going to go maybe for what we'd like to call rapid fire questions.
Sure.
So the first question is, what would you say is something, an element or a strategy or something in particular that you use or that you think that almost any project for gamification or game-based learning could benefit from? What's that one thing that you say, well, if you use this, it'll be better. It won't be perfect. It won't be the only thing you do, but if you use this element, it would be a lot better. Maybe a best practice. some would call it.
Authenticity in scenario design. If the situation is too hypothetical or too far out, your participant and player will have a very difficult time immersing themselves in the role.
Okay,
so
that makes a lot of sense.
It's got to be authentic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely a first timer, and I had never thought of it that way, but it's beautiful. Actually, I'd say. Michael, what would you say is currently your or maybe your all-time favorite game?
Go.
I was thinking of maybe curbing the answer a bit towards that, but I said no, let's just leave it. And Michael will say what the first thing that comes to his mind, but certainly that's a game that was going around the conversation. So.
Well, what I like about it is its simplicity. It only has two types of pieces, white and black equivalent of pawns, and once they're placed, they cannot be moved. So at another level, it's one of the most complex games I have ever seen, and Shinto monks can take 3 days of thought, reflection, and action to go through one game.
Wow. I think I've never played a game for that long. Even when I spend, maybe 12 hours stopping for a quick meal or something like that, not sleeping for a whole day was maybe too much, even for a young kid. Michael, who would you like to listen to interviewed in this podcast in Professor Game?
Well, being a fan of Carl, I'm glad to see he was one of your early folks. But there's a new fellow who I have found embodies the entrepreneurial spirit towards simulations and serious games as a corporate executive in charge of his own company. His name is Kevin Allen.
Okay.
And his company is eigames.com.
Okay, I'll find him. To be honest, I think the name rings a bell, but I'm not. I wouldn't be able to put for sure. I know who this person is. I'll look for him right after this podcast because it piqued my curiosity a lot.
You'll find him a fascinating individual with a very unusual perspective because he used to be a Fifth or Madison Avenue madman. Madmen in North America are the advertising execs who come up with all of these interesting advertising programs and campaigns.
Very creative person for sure.
Yes.
That's very useful. That's very useful for gamification and simulations. Michael, what book would you recommend to the engagers?
Now, when you say book, we're talking from the perspective of design, mechanics.
I would say I don't like to restrict it to any specific area. But if you say, well, if you read this book, you'll get better at this, or you'll learn something interesting, or you might be able to follow this process that this person has created. Or, I mean, one book that you would say, well, I would recommend if you haven't read it yet for you to get into this book and make the best of it.
Well, there has been a brand new book released recently by two colleagues in Europe that I find to be revolutionary in how it talks about innovation in business and games. It's called Gamification for Business: Why Innovators and Change Makers Use Games to Break Down Silos, Drive Engagement, and Build Trust. It's by two individuals, Gudiksen, Gudiksen, and Inlove, Inlove. I think they're both Scandinavian.
I've never heard of that book. I'm certainly going to look it up.
It was just recently released, and it's starting to it's starting to spread in Europe like wildfire.
I'm sure. Sounds like a great book. Michael, what would you say is your superpower, your sweet spot when designing a product for gamification or a game-based learning approach to education?
Building trust and a sense of integrity with my players.
Very useful. If people don't trust in what you're doing, they're probably not going to engage. And that's one of the main things in a game. If you don't engage with the game and you accept the rules and accept that you're in a new place that is not the reality, then you don't abide by the rules, and then you're probably not playing. So it doesn't make sense for you to be in the game. So that's super, super important.
Thanks.
Now, Michael, we're going to move into a slightly gamified part of the of the podcast, and I'm gonna jump into a random question. I still don't know which it is, but I do know it does make sense. So previously, I curated the questions for you to make sure that they make sense, but I don't know which is gonna come. So, okay, here is this question from no name, so I can't name the person. So, okay. I would like to hear cases of how gamification helped obtain positive results in real life, high-stakes scenarios in business and otherwise. Do you have maybe a key example that you would say this when I used gamification in this scenario, it provided a result that you can talk about very, very concretely, because it looks like this person is very, very straight to the point.
Yes, I could present a case. There is a simulation tool called Fligby, which is Fligby. It stands for Flow is Good for Business for You.
Okay.
It is a leadership simulation that places an individual as the new general manager of a winery in California, and they have to interact with all of the individuals in the organization as well as the community to be able to make a profit, be ecologically sound, and to build flow. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian psychologist.
Yes, yeah, I am. Oh, I think we've mentioned him before, but he's the guy who precisely talks about the flow theory. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And his name is impronounceable for me. It was in Hungary. I was in Hungary a few weeks ago, and like every single thing I tried to read was, and my mom's Polish, so Polish is not an easy language, which I don't speak either, but I can understand, listen to, and if they say a word, I can repeat it. But Hungarian was like beyond, and I'm decent with languages, so his last name I'm afraid I'm not very, very capable of pronouncing.
Well, Csikszentmihalyi consulted with the designers of this game to introduce a flow meter into the simulation, along with identifying and assessing 21 leadership competencies during the playing of the sim. This is not a simple sim. This takes 8 to 12 hours to play.
Wow, that's intense.
And normally it starts out with a facilitation session that introduces the case material and helps to situate the players, most of whom are involved, and in this case, were involved in a corporate environment where the senior leadership wanted to identify the emerging leaders to start coaching and mentoring them over the next 5 years to take more senior positions in the firm. And
very high stakes, for sure.
Oh, very much so. And during the playing of the game, the facilitator has the chance to watch how individuals answer and respond to the different decisions or make sense of the problems that are there. And at the end of the simulation, there's another debriefing talking about what went on. There is no one approach or answer to win the game. The biggest win is whether you can create flow through the flow meter as it's being assessed by the way you interact with people and your emotional intelligence skills. And then a report is generally generated from Fligby, which can go to HR directors or senior executives to see where the strengths and areas for improvement are for the individuals who are being considered for more senior leadership positions.
Wow, wow, wow. It sounds amazing and very deep. I mean, that's the kind of thing when we talk about that we've mentioned this many times before about the flaws that we have that are repairable and that there's many things that we can do. But when we talk about, for example, the grading system and how tests are most commonly done and how they fail for many people. I mean, and it's not probably the person's fault, as they say. If you evaluate a fish and his ability to climb a tree, he's going to fail. But he's a fantastic swimmer. So that kind of situation where you actually evaluate the people doing the thing that you're expecting them to do, and you have a system that can back that up with. I'm sure there's a lot of research behind it.
There is.
That's exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about, and it's almost like peeking into the future. In my belief, that's the kind of thing that will drive education forward, and that's the kind of thing that we strive for when we talk about gamification and changing education and changing the whole system as a whole through strategies that we like to call gamification. So thanks a lot for that one, Michael.
Well, in fact, it's my theory that these new serious games and sims, role-playing, LARPs, ludology, they're all building upon a brand new language on the planet for us to find ways to motivate and engage new behaviors. And back in the 60s and 70s, Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian in the communications area, talked about the media is the message. I'm a proponent at this stage that gaming, play, fun within the serious game and sim context will generate a new meta language we will start to use to overcome complexity, volatility, the uncertainty around us.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree. Michael, lastly, we were also talking and you mentioned that you might be publishing a book in maybe this year. Is that right?
Yes. September of this year it'll be coming out. I'm about 4 chapters in. My co-author is about 4 chapters in. We've got maybe a chapter or 2 each to go. And it will be on how to really market and create the business case in organizations for game-based learning using serious games and sims.
Something I'm definitely going to look into. So please let me know when that's coming out.
Will do.
Once it comes out, because it's something I'm definitely very interested in taking a look at. So Michael, if there's anything else that you'd like to add to this interview, please go ahead. And also, I would like to ask you after that to give the engagers a final piece of advice. Especially, I like to gear it towards those that are starting off or who are on the fences yet and taking a look at this podcast and reading something. Let them know what do you think would be like perhaps a nice next step or maybe just encouragement into why this works. Whatever you wish would be a useful advice for our listeners.
Well, I must say that one of the fears most new designers will have is that their games will either be boring, unplayable, or just plain crap. Accept that. It will. Your first 3 games, more than likely, will be the worst possible games you will ever design. But that's because you need that experience. Just as when you started to drive a car, you had to learn how the clutch worked if it was a manual transmission. Even an automatic, you had to learn how to merge into traffic on very fast highways. And when most of us were younger and started to learn to drive, we got into a number of accidents. That's normal. That's the thing I want people to realize. That's normal. Do that. As we were speaking of earlier, act and do. Make it happen. You've got to have those under your belt. And yes, the players that play that are going to turn their face yellow and they're going to tell you this is boring and crap. However, learn from others as well. Take apart other games. Figure out what it is that motivates players in a game And there are multiple dimensions for these. And don't be afraid to contact the game authors to learn more. Most game authors would welcome a conversation over the phone or in person because you're interested in how they think and feel and behave. And those are the three major dimensions for any game: the cognitive side, the emotional side, and the behavioral side. So if you can talk to a few authors of games, you're going to learn so much more after you've tanked your first 3 games.
That's fantastic advice. And again, failure is not final, it's not fatal. And there's many ways to fail forward. And something I like to do, and when people are starting off especially, is to let the students know this is something that you're testing out, and ask for their help, involve them. And it could be a fantastic experience for learning for the two sides, for you and for your learners, for sure.
Exactly.
Michael, is there any way that we can contact you in the future? Any webpage that you would like to drop right here? And I guess that after that, it will be time to say game over.
Well, I believe I've forwarded to you my LinkedIn URL.
Yes.
Please make that and my email that I had forwarded to you available. I'm more than happy to engage people in a great conversation.
Fantastic. I will put those on the show notes. Michael Sutton, with 2 T's in his last name, Sutton, Michael, as in Michael. You can probably find him on LinkedIn, but anyways, it will be available as well. You can go to professorgame.com/podcast, and you will be able to find Michael very, very easily. So Michael, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your experience, for sharing all of these experiences that you've had with the engagers. But now it's time to say game over.
Game over it is. Thanks so much, Roberto.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Engagers, it's fantastic to have you around. This podcast only makes sense because we have you. Let's connect on Twitter so you can let me know who would you like to have as a guest on Professor Game. What would you expect from Professor Game in the future? What are the struggles that you might be having right now in your gamification, or getting started with gamification, or on your latest gamification project? My Twitter account is @RobAlvarezB. Let's get the conversation started. I'm always sharing content on gamification, especially around education. So if you really enjoy these kinds of episodes with people like Michael Sutton, you might want to wait before you click continue, because perhaps you would like to know what the 7-step process of Pete Jenkins looks like, don't you? Then you have to listen to the next episode of Professor Game with Pete Jenkins. It's next week. See you there.